Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to. Okay, this is reading Carl Schmitt today, Carl Schmitt's Political Theology. This is my break. This is a special series. I'm actually doing it during the time I said I was going to be on break. So, therefore, it's before my Montesquieu. And I did it out of some interested people saying I should do it. Why political theology? In that political theology is one of the background works of Schmitt. It's not really early. It's not really late. It's just before. It is written at that transition moment between his earlier writing, which focuses on law and legal structures, his political romanticism, and his Catholic political form of 1919. It is starting with political theology. Does he make his kind of big break, his move, dynamic break with a kind of previous legal thinking to which is very focused clearly within the theory of the state and seeing the theological dimensions of this. Now, he always had a kind of attention to the theological dimension or religious aspects of political ideas. Hence his 1919, the Roman Church as the Catholic Church, the Roman Church or Church as a political form. Uh, Now, it is in chapter 3 where he gives which gets the title of the book of political theology. So let's turn to this chapter. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systemic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. In other words, it's not only because they were taken from theology, but also because the systemic structure that they did. This idea is the system structure, because of their systemic structure, uh, uh, um, uh, in the sense that they're secularized theological concepts, uh, in the sense that the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological concept. So even he's arguing that sociology, modern sociology, rests on a kind of secularization of theological concepts. So the exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle in theology. So he's saying the role of the exception versus the norm, right? This idea, the exception versus the norm. The norm is what is the typical legal structure, how law will do it, and then the realm of the exception is where the law does not necessarily have any answer, right? It doesn't offer a solution or an answer. That there's the law just simply can't address this, and he's saying that this is in many sense analogous to the role of the miracle in theology. Only by being aware of this analogy can we appreciate the manner in which the philosophic ideas of the state developed in the last centuries. So this is basically by saying that over the 19th, 18th, and 17th and 16th, from these series, the modern state, the modern theory of the state. The idea of the modern constitutional state triumphed together with deism, a theological metaphysics that banished the miracle from the world. This theology and metaphysics rejected not only the transgression of the laws of nature through an exception brought about by direct intervention, as as is found in the idea of a miracle, but also the sovereign's direct intervention in the valid legal order. So he's saying that the period of deity. Now let me just get this clarified. He's saying there's kind of a correlation or something. These things are happening as deism rise. Deism basically is kind of a natural theology, in that it assumes that a God creator exists, but once he creates it, he doesn't intervene anymore. And once the creator has created his system, there's no longer he's not necessarily an active agent constantly intervening. Whereas the older view is that the God creator is the creator who constantly intervenes, right? Miracles, right? The intervention of God is seen as the miracle, right? Well, this is similar to the idea of what he's saying, that the intervention of the sovereign creates this. The argument is this view: the sovereign creates a system, but then doesn't intervene, or intervenes very rarely. Whereas that the idea of the earlier monarchies is the sovereign is the king who constantly intervenes, right? In other words, the idea of the miracle, but also the sovereign's direct intervention is in a valid legal order. The rationalism of the Enlightenment rejected the exception in every form. So, therefore, the idea of the Enlightenment, this Enlightenment idea that in other words, the concept that there's an exception that requires the sovereign to act, is similar to the idea of that there's necessary miracles that necessarily have to be, right? And the Enlightenment rejects this idea that the system is perfect. The system is, the legislature has created the system and the system works, and there's no need for the intervention of the creator at this moment. This is the idea. Conservative authors of the counter-revolution, but this is the counter to the French Revolution, who were theists, could thus attempt to support the personal sovereign of the monarch ideologically, with the aid of analogies from a theistic, that's theistic. It's this typo. It's typos. This edition of political theology has tons of typos. Very annoying. I want to complain about my edition here. So let's. I have for a long time referred to the significance of such fundamental systemic and methodological analogies. A detailed presentation of the meaning of the concept of the miracles in this context will have to be left for another time. So, therefore, he's not going to give a detailed a discussion of. In this thing, he's not going to give a detailed concept of the meaning of the concept of miracles. Okay. What is relevant here is only the extent in which this concept is appropriate for a sociological juristic. Okay, that's a T, juristic, TIC, concepts. In other words, that sociology of judicial concepts. That this, in other words, the idea of the miracle and its connection to the norm is appropriate for a. If we're going to have it, in other words, he's saying that there's in other words, taking the idea, using a kind of an analogous analogy of the miracle, the role of the miracle, God's role in the miracle, and looking at it from the view of an analogy to understand a sociology of juristic concepts, the role of the sovereign acting in the exception, right? The most interesting political application of such analogies is found in Catholic philosophers of the counter-revolution and Blonde, Dimas, Donis Cortes. What we immediately recognize in them is a conceptually clear and systemic analogy, and not merely the kind of playing with ideas, whether metaphysical, natural, philosophical, or even romantic, which, as with everything else, so also with state and society, yields colorful symbols and pictures. In other words, he's saying that these people deal with, in other words, not playing with the ideas, but really the concrete. That these Catholic counter-revolutionary thinkers are offering kind of a clear conceptually clear and systemic analogy. The connection between these two, the idea of God, its relationship with miracles, and the idea of the sovereign intervening in the exception, right? And this is not, in other words, and not playing with ideas, whether metaphysical, natural, philosophical, or even romantic. Because why? Because of the state and society problem. And he says that because this relationship between the state and society is colorful symbols and pictures. And that's the problem. This is the whole metaphor of state and society. And I would even blame Hobbes for this more than Hobbes. Hobbes is as much to blame for this, and I'm not sure. This is where I think Schmitt who likes Hobbes, but he doesn't mention Hobbes here. He falls to the Catholic. But here, this is where Hobbes is probably the father of this systemic slit here, and that there is this problem of what is the relationship between state and society. There, I've always argued that state and society are synonymous Siamese twins. They're identical entities, but they're fundamentally the state and society have to be the same fundamental thing, in that sense that they are talking about or addressing the same fundamental people, space, and sphere. They're just two dimensions of the same phenomena. In a sense, they are like Siamese twins. They cannot be divorced from each other in a fundamental sense, and that this is why there's a lot of this. There is this mystical, natural, philosophical, and even romantic conceptions of the question of state and society, right? But let us continue. The clearest philosophical expression of that analogy is found in Leibniz. Now, this is the new method, right? Leibniz's new method, he's saying, emphasizing the systemic relationship between jurisprudence and theology. He rejected a comparison of jurisprudence with medicine and mathematics. We have deservedly transferred the model of our division from theology to jurisprudence because the similarity of these two disciplines is astonishing. Both have a double principle, reason, hence there is a natural theology and a natural jurisprudence, and scripture, which means a book with positive revelations and directive. So therefore, Leibniz's idea is a rational, or in other words, there's this rational account of things, and then there is this positive account of the book, the law. Okay, the Torah, right? This is the idea of the book, which is the Torah, which is the law, right? The Judaic conceptions. This is Judaic conceptions. Schmitt maybe had to take that. Alfred Menzel noted in an essay that today's sociology has assumed functions that were exercised in the 17th and 18th centuries by natural law, namely to utter demands for justice, to enumerate philosophical historical constructions or ideas. In other words, 19th and 20th century sociology replaces the scope of what was done by the 16th and 17th century natural law thinking. Okay, and that's and this is what his point is, that there's a rejection of natural law, and where the natural law understanding was there's a higher order, and that this norm, these laws of norms, usually created by God. The argument was God created the laws then create the rules by which we do it. So what sociology does is replaces God and a system. There is a social system, a social network, which to enumerate historical constructions and ideas. He seems to believe that sociology is inferior to jurisprudence, which is supposed to have become positive. In other words, sociology is supposed to have become positive. Okay. The sociology inferior to jurisprudence, which is supposed to have become positive. He attempts to show that all, therefore, theological systems end up by making political tendencies appear scientific. In other words, sociology is nothing more than what he says, making political tendencies appear scientific. This attack on sociology is something, and so it seems to be. But whoever takes the trouble of examining the public law literature of positive jurisprudence for its basic concepts and arguments will see that the state intervenes everywhere, in other words, that at times it does so as a deus ex machina, to decide according to positive statutory controversy that the independent act of the juristic perception failed to bring to the general plausible solution. At other times, it does so as the graceful and merciful Lord who proves by pardons and amnesties his superiority over his own laws. Right. So therefore, the state constantly acts as he says, either directs ex machina and addresses answers that the system cannot do itself, or it acts as a kind of pardon, a merciful, a grateful Lord who pardons and gives amnesties to even his laws. Right. This is this idea that The more you look at the law, this idea of the positivist jurisprudence, right, for concepts, you see an intervening state everywhere. There always exists the same inexplanatory identity: lawgiver, executive power, police, pardon, and welfare institution. Thus, to an observer who takes the trouble to look at the total picture of contemporary jurisprudence, there appears a huge cloak and dagger drama in which the state acts in many disguises, but always as the same invisible person. The omnipotence of the modern lawgiver, for which one reads in every textbook on public law, is not only linguistically derived from theology. Many reminiscences of theology also appear in the details of the argument, most, of course, with polemic intent. In a positivistic age, it is easy to reproach an intellectual opponent with the charge of indulging in theology or metaphysics. If the reproach were intended as more than a mere insult, at least the following question would suggest itself. In other words, if this was this claim, what is the source of the inclination for such a theological and metaphysical derailment? So, what is the source of this thing? One would have, one would had to investigate whether there may be an explained historically, perhaps, an after effect of monarchical public laws, which identified the theistic God with the king, or whether they are underpinned by systemic or methodological necessities. So, in other words, if you're going to say that if this is not just a mere approach, this kind of a slam, but a real question. You'd have to look at the juristic understandings, right, to see the source of this theological metaphysical uh, logic or the metaphor that's being used, right? One would have had to investigate whether there was a kind of relationship because of the role of the king, right? Because of the role of the monarchical public law, its origins, right? The effects, and therefore, because the God and the king are connected, and therefore they're underpinned by systemic methodological necessity. I readily admit that because of an inability to master intellectually contradictory arguments or objections, some jurists introduced the state in their work by a mental shortcut, just as certain metaphysicians misuse the name of God. But this does not yet solve the substantive problem. Right? Until now, one has generally satisfied with the causal. In other words, until now, one was generally satisfied with causal limitations only. In other words, we were satisfied with causal limitations. So he says, in his publication on the law, in the formal and material sense, Albert Hanel raised the old objection that it is metaphysical to demand for the sake of uniformity and reliability of the state will, both of which he does not deny, in the concentration of all functions of the state in one organ. In other words, he says, raised the old objection that it's metaphysical demand for the sake of uniform and reliability of the state's will, the concentration of all functions in one state organ. So therefore, this idea that one state organ has all these functions, right? This is metaphysical. Hugo Prus, too, attempted to defend his association concept of the state by relegating his opponents to theology and metaphysics. The concept of sovereignty and the theory of the state by Lambard and Jelinek, and the theory of the sole supremacy of the state makes the state an abstract person, so to speak, unum cum genus, something that, with the monopoly of power mysterically produced, right? In other words, the old theory. Sorry about that interruption. Um, make sure there's no more interruptions. Okay, sorry about that. In other words, looking at this and saying that this actor here that has monopoly of state mystical produced, right? That the sole supremacy of the state to make an abstract person, so to speak, this uh, 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 suggenus, real, this real, to come, this thing to become real, right? With the monopoly of power that is produced, right? To prove this was a legal disguise of the theory of the divine right of kings, a repetition of the teaching of Morenbeck, with the modification that the religious fiction is replaced by a juristic fiction, right? So Proust's argument: this is just a fiction. This is just old theological concept, and we should abandon it. And therefore, again, this is the whole point, right? And this is why people like Proust wants to argue that okay must be the associational concept, right? Thus, Proust, representative of the organic theory of the state, right? This okay, reproached his opponent for theologizing. In his critical studies on the concept of the juristic person, uh, Benetzik maintained that on the one hand, it is precisely the organic origin of the state that is that is theology. Benetzik attempted to destroy the organic idea of Stein, Schultz, Gierke, and Proust with a sneering remark that if organs of a collective legal person were once again persons, then every administrative authority, every court, and so on would be a juristic person, and the state in its entirety would be also once again to be such a sole juristic person, right? The attempts to comprehend the dogma of the Trinity would, by comparison, be an easy matter. In other words, he's making fun. They're making fun of this understanding of this, saying that these parts would be therefore the whole would be, right, and therefore this would be making the attempt to comprehend the dogma of the Trinity would by comparison, would be an easy matter. He also dismissed Straub's opinion that the entire collective personality is a legal person with the sentence that he does not understand twists like this one that are reminiscent of the dogma of the Trinity. Yet he himself said it already resides in the concept of legal competence, that its source, the state's legal order, must posit itself as the subject of all law, consequently as a juristic person. Right. So therefore, he contradicts himself. He's pointing out Schmitt. This process of positing itself was apparently so simple and plausible to Bernanzik that he mentioned a deviating opinion as representing only a curiosity. Nevertheless, he did not ask himself why there is a greater logical necessity for the source of legal competence, namely the legal order, that is, the state's legal order, to posit itself as a product than there is for Stahl's dictum that only a person can be the basis of another person, right? So therefore, the person would be another person. This is Stahl's dictum. In other words, how can this thing? In other words, he did not ask why there's a greater logical necessity for this to happen than for this to happen, right? Kelsen has the merit of having stressed since 1920 the methodological relationship of theology and jurisprudence. In his last work on the sociological and juristic concept of the state, he introduced many analogies. Though diffuse, these analogies make it possible for those with a deeper understanding of the understanding of the history of ideas to discern the heterogeneity between his neo-Kantian epistemological point of departure and his ideological and democratic results. In other words, the connection between the neo-Kantian epistemological position and the underlying ideological and democratic results, right? At the foundation of his identification of state and legal order rests a metaphysics that identifies the lawfulness of nature and the normative lawfulness. In other words, the lawfulness of nature and normative lawfulness. This pattern of thinking is characteristic of the natural sciences. It is based on the rejection of all arbitrariness and attempts to banish from the realm of human mind every exception. In other words, this is like the 19th century natural theologian in the sense that the perfect order is that the order is once the creation is perfectly works. There's no exceptions. There's no breakdowns of the system. Therefore, there's no need for the exception. Right. This is the whole point. In other words, there's an order. There's lawfulness in the system. There's no disorder. There's nothing, and therefore the norms apply. The rules are there and they work perfectly well. We don't need to have any problem. There's nothing about this. This pattern of thinking is characterized by natural science. It is based on the rejection of all arbitrariness and attempts to banish from the realms of human mind every exception. In the history of the parallel theology and jurisprudence, such a conviction finds its place most appropriately, probably in John Stuart Mill. In his interest of objectivity, and because of his fear of arbitrariness, he too emphasized the validity without exception of every kind of law. Again, pointing that there is a kind of like Kelson's things. You can see the origins of it in someone like Mill. Mill, this was again. He says that Mill is afraid of arbitrariness. Mill is afraid of therefore, his interest of objectivity and fear of arbitrariness. But he probably did not assume, as did Kelson, that the free deed of legal perception could shape any mass of. In other words, he did not assume, as Kelson does, but in other words, now this is where Mill differs from Kelson. He's saying that the free deed of legal perception could shape just any mass of positive law into the cosmos of its system, because this would nullify the objectivity already established. In other words, there's for Mill, there's the objectivity of the natural order, and therefore it just couldn't be what he says here. In other words, that the free deed of legal perception could shape any mass of positive laws into a cosmos of its system, because this would nullify the objectivity already achieved. For a metaphysics that suddenly falls into the pathos of objectivity, it should make no difference whether the unconditional positivism directly adheres to the law that presents itself, or whether it bothers to establish whether it bothers to first establish a system. Does it make a law? Does this metaphysics want to make a law, or does it first make a system, then make a law? Right? Kelson, as soon as he goes one step beyond his methodological criticism, operates with a concept of causation that is entirely natural scientific. This is most clearly demonstrated by his belief that Hume's and Kant's concepts of substance can be transferred to the theory of the state. But he fails thereby to see that the concept of substance in scholastic thought is entirely different from that in mathematical and natural scientific thinking. So he's saying that, what is Schmitt is saying here? In other words, the concept of substance. In other words, okay, so you're going to say this is substance. The substance plays the concept of substance, right, plays a role in the theory of the state. But the Hume's / Kant's understanding of what the substance is differs from the scholastic concept of the substance, Schmitt is saying. Okay? In other words, entirely different from these kind of things. The distinction between the substance and the practice of law, which is the fundamental significance of the history of the concept of sovereignty, cannot be grasped with concepts rooted in the natural sciences, and yet is an essential element of legal argumentation. Right? This is what he's saying here. In other words, you have to understand. Maybe you have to understand the concept from its source, right? Not from not taking something from here to there, right? When Kelson gives the reasons for opting for democracy, he openly reveals the mathematical and naturalistic scientific character of his thinking. Democracy is the expression of a political relativism and a scientific orientation that are liberated from miracles and dogma and based on human understanding and critical doubt. Okay? In other words, this idea that his democracy is based on this scientific understanding, this political relativism, and the and a scientific and the liberated from miracles and dogma, right? This idea, and based on a human understanding and critical doubt. For the sociological concept, in other words, for the sociological for the sociology of the concept of sovereignty, it is altogether vital to be clear about the sociology of legal concepts as such. The aforementioned systematic analogy between theological and juristic concepts is stressed here precisely because a sociology of legal concepts presupposes a consistent and radical ideology. In other words, this is a quote in that sense. In other words, it presupposes a existing. I think there's a quote there. Where's the beginning quote mark? This is a little annoying. Yet it would be erroneous to believe therein resides a spiritual philosophy of history as opposed to a materialist one. So let's go here for a second. Let's think of this paragraph. In other words, for the concept of sociology, the concept of sovereignty is altogether vital to be clear about sociology of legal concepts and such, right? If this aforementioned systemic analogy between theological and juristic. Again, interrupted, sorry. So let's get this paragraph we were interrupted by. The aforementioned systemic analogy between the theological and juristic concepts is stressed here precisely because a sociology of legal concept presupposes a consistency in radical ideology, consistent and radical ideology. In other words, the systemic and structure has to be consistent on the logical level, right? An ideological level. What ideology means a system of belief, right? Yet it would be erroneous to believe that therein resides a spiritualist philosophy of history as opposed to a materialistic one. So it's kind of, in other words, is there a spiritualist philosophy of history as opposed to a materialist one? In other words, this would be erroneous to believe that therein resides a spiritual as opposed to a materialistic one. Right? So there's something funny, there's something wrong here. The spirits that you have to argue that there has to be kind of a consistent logic. The political theology of the Restoration offers an explicit, exemplary illustration of the sentence Max Weber articulated in his critique of Rudolf Stammler's philosophy of right, namely that it is impossible to confront irrefutably a radical materialist philosophy of history with a similarly radical spiritualist philosophy of history. In other words, these things you can't refute. In other words, you have to refute within the same logical system. In other words, you can't. In other words, you can't refute this system by that system. He said, yes, that Max Weber says here, right? The author of The Counter-Revolution explained political change as a result of a change in outlook that traced the French Revolution to the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It was nothing more than a clear antithesis, which, when the radical revolutionaries conversely attributed a change in thought to a change in the pattern of political and social conditions. That religious, philosophical, and aesthetic and literary changes are closely linked with political and social conditions was already a widespread dogma in Western Europe, especially in France in the 1820s. In the Marxist philosophy of history, this interdependence is radicalized to an economic dependence. It is given a systemic basis by seeking a point of ascription for political and social changes by finding it in the economic sphere. This materialistic explanation makes a separate consideration of ideology impossible, because else everywhere it only sees reflections and disguises of economic relations. Consequently, it looks with suspicion at psychological explanations and interpretations, at least in their vulgar form, right? Precisely because of its massive rationalism, this philosophy can easily turn into an irrationalist conception of history, since it conceives all thought as being a function and an emanation of vital processes, right? The arch syndicalist socialism of Georges Soros thus linked in this fashion Henry Bergson's philosophy of life with Marx's conception of history. So Bergson's philosophy of life and Marx are both systemic things, but this is materialistic and this is something else going on here, right? But this is why the arch syndicalist socialism of this link these two things together. Both the spiritualist explanation of the material process and the materialist explanation of spiritual phenomena seek causal relations. Both of them do. At first, they construct a construct between the two spheres, and then they dissolve this construct into nothing but by reducing one to the other. Say before, this is what the words Bergson tried this with the concept of moving from was it the material to the spirit, the material to the spiritual, and whereas Marx the spiritual to the material, right? Uh, uh, um, Reducing one to the other. This method must necessarily climb a character, just as Engels saw the Calvinist dogma of predestination as a reflection of capitalist competition in terms of its senseless and incalculability. It would be easily to reduce the theory of modern relativity. It would be reduced the modern theory of relativity and its success to currency relations in today's world market, and thus to find the economic basis of that theory. In other words, modern theory of relativity here connected with this. Therefore, some would call such a procedure. Some would call such a procedure the sociology of the concept of a concept or a theory. This, however, is no concern to us. In other words, someone called this a sociology of a concept of applying this method. It is otherwise, in other words, this idea that you can take these things and say, "Oh, it is connected like that." There's, that the theory of relativity and its success. In other words, it's reduced the modern theory of relativity and its success to currency relations in today's world market, right? And thus to find economic basis of the theory of relativity, right? Some would call this this a procedure, the sociology of a concept or a theory. But this is no concern to us. This point he's saying. He gives that example, and then he says it's not concerned for us. It is otherwise with the sociological method, which, with a view to certain ideas and intellectual constructions, seeks the typical group of persons who arrive at a certain logical result from a particularity of their sociological situation. In other words, we're looking at a group of people, typical group of persons, who arrive at an ideological certain belief system. From what? From the peculiarity of their social. In other words, the sociological situation means they're, the group they're in, the group or the statistical group that they're in, the demographic statistical group they're in, right? In this sense, one can speak of a sociology of juristic concepts. In the case of Max Weber, who traced the differentiation of the various legal fields to development of trained jurists, civil servants who administer justice, or legal dignitaries. The sociological peculiarities of the group of persons who profess concerns themselves with forming law necessitates defining methods and views of juristic thinking. But this is still not a sociology of the legal concepts. So therefore, the method of Weber gives us a method, but this is still not a sociology of a legal concept. To trace a conceptual result back to its sociological carrier is psychological, he said. Okay? It involves the determination of a certain kind of motivation of human action. This is a sociological problem, but not a problem but not a problem of the sociology of a concept. If this method is applied to intellectual accomplishments, it thus leads to explanations in terms of the milieu and even the indigenous psychology that is known as the sociology of specific types, that is, of the bureaucratic, an attorney or professor who's employed by the state. The Hegelian system, for example, if investigated by applying this method, would have to be characterized as a philosophy of a professional lecturer who by his economic and social situation is enabled to be is enabled to become with contemplative superiority, aware of absolute consciousness, which means to practice his profession as a lecturer of philosophy. Or it would be possible to view Kelson's jurisprudence of an ideology of the lawyer bureaucrat practicing in changing political circumstances, who, under the most derisive forms of arbitrary authority, under the most divisive forms of authority, with a relativistic superiority over momentary political authority, seeks to order systemically the positive decrees and regulations that are handed down to him. In other words, he's trying to give order to impose order to it. In this, in its consequent manner of this type of sociology, is best assigned to bell letters, right? Again, the bell letters are like novelists in that sense, right? It provides a socio-psychological portrait, provided by a method that cannot be distinguished from the brilliant literary criticism of Saint Beuve, for example. Altogether different is the sociology concept. Therefore, this is not. He's saying we use sociological methods to create a kind of psychology of why the actors do things, but this is more like something more fitting for novelists than for this, because it doesn't really give us a concept of this sociology of concepts. Altogether different is the sociology of concept, which is advanced here and alone has the plausibility of achieving a scientific result for the concept for a concept of such a sovereignty. This sociology of concepts transcends juridical conceptualization oriented to immediate practical interest. In other words, it transcends the juristic conceptualization oriented to immediate practice. In other words, the juristic concept deals with the medium of solving this decision, right? The immediate consequence, we have a decision that we have to solve it. Okay, this sociology of concepts trying to understand, well, how does this concept arrive, right? And it's not dealing to the immediate practical interest. Its aims is to discover the basic radical systemic structure and to compare this conceptual structure with the conceptually represented social structure of a certain epoch, certain time, certain this place, this epoch in the sense. There is no question here of whether the idealities, the idealities produced, the ideal points, the idea things produced by radical conceptualizations are a reflex of sociological reality. In other words, there's no question here whether these idealities produced by radical conceptualization. So these things that are produced by these things, radical conceptualization, are a reflex of sociological reality, or whether social reality is conceived as a result of a particular kind of thinking and therefore of acting. In other words, there's no question. In other words, there's a problem here. Are these things produced by this conceptualization? Are they merely reflexes of sociological reality? So sociological reality create these concepts, or whether social reality itself is a result of people, a particular kind of thinking and therefore acting by people holding these ideas. Okay? He says there's no question here whether this is that or that. Rather, the social, in other words, it's not. It's that's like saying this. He's saying that this is chicken egg problem. And therefore, this is not. There is no question here of this. This is saying that these two things are chicken egg. Which rather, the sociology of the concept is concerned with establishing proof of two spiritual, but at the same time substantial identities. It is thus not a sociology of the concept It is thus not a sociology of the concept of sovereignty when, for example, the monarchy of the 17th century is characterized the real as the real that is mirrored in the Cartesian concept of God. In other words, this is not a thus it is thus not a sociology of the concept of sovereignty when, for example, the monarchy of the 17th century is characterized as the real that is mirrored in the Cartesian concept of God, right? But it is a sociology of the concept of sovereignty when the political historical status of the monarchy of that epoch is shown to be correspondent to the general state of consciousness that was characterized in Western Europe at that time. And when the juristic construction of the historic political reality can find a concept whose structure is in accord with the structure of the metaphysical concept. So in other words, he's saying it's not that this is that. He's saying this is not to say that this God in other words, to say that, for example, a monarchy of this is characterized by the real that is mirrored in Cartesian concept of God is not really in other words, that's a direct causality. He's saying here, whereas what is a sociology, what is a properly understood as sociological concept of sovereignty, right? This would not. In other words, this example here is not a concept of the science of sociology, but because it's too specific, it doesn't offer alternative cases, right? Here he says what? That when the social, historic, political status of the monarch, right, of that period of time, is shown to correspond to a general state of consciousness that was characterized in European at that time. So this understanding of the monarchy, the political social status of the monarch, is connected to corresponds to the general state of consciousness that's characterized at that epoch at that time, right? And when the juristic construction of this reality can find a concept whose structure is in accordance with the structure of the metaphysical concept, monarchy thus becomes as self-evident in the consciousness of that period as democracy does in the latter epochs. You see, in other words, it is explaining that therefore this model will offer different alternatives. So therefore, if your different understanding of the role of the words, the role of the monarch, a role of rule in this epoch, connected with the concept of the general consciousness of that same people at that time and that same period. And the juristic concepts of this same period can find concepts that make these things all accord. They all follow the same kind of logic. This is a sociological concept. So monarchy becomes as self-evident in consciousness of that period as democracy does in later epoch. The presupposition of this kind of sociology of juristic concepts is thus a radical conceptualization, a consistent thinking that is pushed into metaphysics and theology. The metaphysical image that a definite epoch forges of the world has the same structure as what the world immediately understands to be appropriate as the form of its political organization. In other words, how do you frame the theological concept of understanding? In other words, of how the epoch forges the world, the metaphysical image, the fundamental understanding of that an epoch, a period of time. This is where there is a kind of historicism in Schmitt in a sense. That there is kind of an understanding that a historical epoch, that history has created a certain epoch, forges a world understanding that has the same structure, that has the same structure as what the world immediately understands to be appropriate as a form of political organization. So therefore, in other words, how does this image of how this period of time structures how we understand things will then also shape how we understand our political organizations. The determination of such an identity is the sociology of the concept of sovereignty. It proves that, in fact, as Edward Card said in his book on Auguste Comte, metaphysics is the most intensive and clearest expression of an epoch. So, in other words, each epoch will have a different metaphysics. The assumption is that every epoch, every world historical epoch, will have a fundamentally different fundamental understandings of metaphysics. Okay, and that this will therefore this different metaphysics will shape our understanding of rule, the kind of political rule, define the concept of how the historical political form, and then shape that will then in turn shape the juristic decision. Schmitt is saying. So, now he's quoting here: immediate and innumerable decrees of the divinity, imminent. Imminent and immutable decrees of the divinity. This was the idea of the legal life of the state that was immediately evident to the rationalism of the 18th century. This utterance is found in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's essays, Political Economy. The politicization of the theological concepts, especially with respect to the concept of sovereignty, is so striking that it has not escaped any true expert of his writing. Said Mille Blenny said, Rousseau applied to the sovereign the idea of the philosophies the philosophers hold of God, that he may do anything that he wills, but he may not will evil. Right? This is the Declaration of Land and Citizens by Jelinek, right? And this is Emile Boltes. In the theory of state of the 17th century, the monarch is identified with God and has in the state a position entirely analogous to that attributed to God in the Cartesian system of the world. According to Etkers, the prince develops all the inherent characteristics of the state of a certain sort of continual creation. The prince of the Cartesian God transposed to the political world. That's another 14. I think this is going to be Agar's book. There is a psychologically, and from the point of view of phenomenologists, phenomenological as well, a complete identity. There is psychologically a complete identity as well as a phenomenology as well, complete identity. A continued thread runs through the metaphysical, political, and sociological concepts that postulate the sovereign as a personal unit and a primeval creator. The final tale of the discourse on method provides an extraordinary and instructive example. It is a document of the new rational spirit. In the depths of doubt, one finds the consolation by using reason unswervingly. Juste sur Dieu intact de la raison. In other words, this is in doubt. You keep on using reason like this, right? But what is that? But what is it that becomes clear in the first place to the mind suddenly forced to reason? That the works created by several masters are not as perfect as those created by one. One sole architect must construct a house in the town. The best constitutions are those that are the work of a sole wise legislature. They are devised only by one. And finally, a sole God governs the world. As Descartes once wrote to Massens, it is God who establishes laws in nature, just as the king establishes laws in his kingdom. Right? This is the metaphor that he uses. This is that reason teaches this idea that there's a structure, there's a logic, and that the one who has a clear plan and a clear will is able to do this. Right? This is that metaphor at the end of the discourse of the method. The 17th and 18th centuries were dominated by this idea of the sole sovereign, which is one of the reasons why, addition to the decisionist cast of his thinking, Hobbes remained personalistically positive and ultimately concrete deciding instance, and why he also highlighted the state, Leviathan, into an immense person, and thus point blank straight into mythology. This he did despite his nominalism and natural scientific approach, and his reduction of the individual to the reduction of the individual to atom. For him, this was no anthropomorphism from which he was truly free, but a methodological and systemic postulate of his juristic thinking. But the image of the architect and the master builder of the world reflects a confusion that is characteristic of the concept of causality. The world architect is simultaneously the creator and legislator, which means the legitimizing authority. Throughout the Enlightenment period until the French Revolution, such an architect of the world and state was called the legislator. It was until this Enlightenment, until the Revolution, such an architecture of the world and the state was called the legislature. Since then, the consistency of exclusive scientific thinking has also permeated political ideas, representing essentially juristical thinking that has predominated the age of enlightenment. The general validity of the legal prescription has become identified with the lawfulness of nature, which applies without exceptions. Therefore, the lawfulness of nature, therefore, the validity of the legal prescription. The sovereign who in the deistic view of the world, even if conceived as residing outside of the world, has remained the engineer of the great machine, has been radically pushed aside. Therefore, the sovereign, who in the deistic view of the world, even if conceived as residing of it, has remained the engineer of that machine, has been pushed aside. The machine now runs itself. The metaphysical presupposition that God emanated only general and not particular declarations of will govern the metaphysics of Leibniz and Nicholas Mellenbach. The general will of our soul became identical with the will of the sovereign, but simultaneously the concept of the general also contained the qualitative determination with regards to its subject, which means the people became the sovereign. In other words, this is the idea of the king like this. There's this change of the decisionistic and personalistic element in the concept of sovereignty was thus lost. The will of the people is always good. The people are always virtuous, said Emile Sales. In whatever manner a nation expresses its wishes, it is enough that it wishes. All forms are good, but its will is always the supreme law. Again, that's Emmanuel Sieyès' understanding of this idea of the general will being tied to the what. In whatever manners a nation expresses its wishes, it is enough that it wishes. All forms are good, but its will is always the supreme law. This is the idea. So what was a decree of an individual now becomes the decree of the whole, right? This is the movement. This is the previous system in that sense. In other words, the general will of our soul became identical with the will of the sovereign, right? But simultaneously, the concept of the general and also contained a quantitative determination with regard to its subject, which means that the people became the sovereign, right? So therefore, it's that line. But the necessity by which the people always will, but the necessity by which the people always wills what is right is not identical with the lightness that emanated from the commands of the personal sovereign. In other words, this logic, that the necessity by which the people, what the people always wills is right, is not identical with the lightness that emanated from the commands of the personal sovereign. Right? The king, in other words, the light that emanated from the in-person sovereign versus that this aggregate sovereign, right? In the struggle of opposing interests, coalitions, the absolute monarchy made the decision and thereby created the unity of the state. The unity that a people represents does not possess this decision as character. It is an organic unity, and with Nadano with okay, this is going to be driving me crazy. Nadano consciousness, the ideas of the state originated as an organic whole. The theistic as well as deistic concept of God becomes thus unintelligible for political metaphysics. In other words, in this organic. In other words, the idea here is what? The organic unity, which this consciousness of this national national consciousness. I think that's what national NATIO and okay. I think that is a type of national. With the national consciousness, the idea of the state originated as an organic whole. The theistic as well as the concept of God becomes thus unintelligible for this political metaphysics. In other words, a unity of people does not possess a decisionist character. It's not a single willing agent. There's an organic unity, and with the national consciousness, the idea of the state originated in an organic whole. Right? It's an aggregation system. It's not one will; it's many wills that you know. The theistic as well as the deistic conception of God becomes unintelligible, he says in this logic. It is true, nevertheless, that for some, okay, now, sorry, another I'm getting a lot of interruptions in this video. It's very annoying. Uh, uh, there was we ended up with this paragraph here, which says that. Now, we got the next sentence. It is okay. It is true, nevertheless, that for some, this typo, time becomes D for some reason in this text. I don't know what's going on with this conversion to EPUB. The after effects of the idea of God remains recognizable. In America, this manifested in reasonable and pragmatic belief that the voice of the people is the voice of God, a belief that is the foundation of Jefferson's victory in 1801. Tocqueville, in his account of American democracy, observed that in democratic thought, the people hover above the entire political life of the state, just as God does above the world, and the cause and the end of all things as the point from which everything emanates and to which everything returns. Today, on the contrary, such a well-known legal and political philosopher of state as Kelsen conceived democracy as an expression of the relativistic and impersonal scientism. This notion is in accord with the development of the political theology and metaphysics in the 19th century. In other words, the difference between this is the different metaphysics. In other words, the American metaphysics that Tocqueville talks about versus then the atheistic metaphysics of the later period, right? But these produces two different understandings of the situation. To the conception of God in the 17th and 18th century belongs the idea of the transcendence vis-a-vis the world, just as that period's philosophy of state belongs the notion of the transcendence of the sovereign vis-a-vis the state. Everything in the 19th century was increasingly governed by the conceptions of immanence. In other words, and all of a sudden, immanence becomes the point. All the identities that recur in the political ideas in the state doctrines of the 19th century rest on such conceptions of immanence, the democratic thesis of the identity of the ruler and the ruled, the organic theory of the state with the identity of the state and sovereignty, the constitutional theory of Krab with the identity of sovereignty and legal order, and finally Kelsen's theory of the identity of state and the legal order. After the writers of the Restoration developed a political theology, the radicals who opposed all existing order directed with heightened awareness, their ideological efforts against the belief in God altogether, fighting that belief as if it were most fundamental expression of the belief of any authority and unity. The battle against God was taken up by Proudhon under the um, clear influence of Augustus Comte. Bakunin continued it with a Scythian fury. In other words, under the influence, Proudhon, under the influence of Kant, continued what Kant did with a Scythian fury. The battle against traditional religiosity can be traced naturally to many different political and sociological motives. The conservative posture, ecclesiastical Christian, the conservative, in other words, the motives. The first motive is the conservative posture of ecclesiastical Christianity, the alliance to throw an altar, the number of prominent authors who were déclassés, the appearance of an art and literature of the 19th century whose genteel representatives, at least in the decisive periods of their lives, had been spat out by the bourgeoisie order. All of this is still largely unrecognized and unappreciated in its sociological detail. In other words, these things, in other words, this trajectory of late 19th century situation. The main line of development will undoubtedly unfold as follows. Conceptions of transcendence will no longer be credible to most educated people, who will settle for either a more or less clear immanence pantheism or a positivist indifference towards any metaphysics. Insofar as it retains the concept of God, the immanence philosophy, which found its greatest systemic thinker in the architect of Hegel, draws God into the world and permits law and the state to emanate from the immanence of the objective. But among the most extreme radicals, a consequent atheism began to prevail. The German left Hegelians were no more conscious of this tendency. They were no less vehement that Proudhon that in proclaiming that mankind had to be substituted for God. Marx and Engels never failed to recognize that this ideal of an unfolding self-conscious mankind must end in anarchical freedom. Precisely because of his useful intuition, the utterance of the young Engels in the year 1842 and 1844 is of the greatest significance. The essence of the state and that of religion is mankind's fear of itself. In other words, that of state and religion is mankind's fear of itself. If viewed from this perspective, the history of ideas is the development of 19th century theory of the state displays two characteristic moments: the elimination of all theistic and transcendental concepts and formulations of new concepts of legitimacy. In other words, that legitimization of this and the formation of a new concept of legitimacy. The traditional principle of legitimacy obviously lost all validity. Neither the vision of the Restoration based on private law and patrimony, nor the one founded in a sentimental and reverent attainment that was able to resist this development. In other words, neither the Restoration based on private law or one founded on a sentimental and reverent attachment was able to resist this. Since 1848, the theory of public law has become positive. And behind this world is usually hidden a dilemma, or the theory has pronounced it in different phrases. The idea that all power resides in the pouvoir constitute of the people, the constitutive power of the people, right? All power resides in the constitutive power of people. This idea that the people themselves collectively produce the real power, right? That's Hobbes, right? That is Hobbes and Rousseau, which means that the democratic notion of legitimacy has replaced the monarchical idea of democracy of consent, right? This is the whole point. Again, this is stuck with here. This is Hobbes right here, right? And Rousseau. It is therefore that an occurrence of the most significant that Duns Scotus, one of the foremost representative of decisionist thinking and a Catholic philosopher of the state, one who intensely conscious of the metaphysical kernel of all politics, concluded in a reference to the Revolution of 1848 that the epoch of royalism was at the end. Royalism is no longer because there are no kings. Therefore, legitimacy no longer exists in a traditional sense. For him, for him, there was thus only one solution: dictatorship. Right? This idea. It, uh, it is. Um, it is the solution that Hobbes also reached by the same kind of decisionist thinking, though mixed with mathematical relativism. Authority non veritas effectum legum. In other words, authority, not truth, makes law. In other words, but again, I think this is where okay, I'm gonna stop here. I think this is where Schmitt doesn't. I can see now Strauss would say, hey, but hey, Hobbes is also the thing of the creation of what you're talking about. That the thing that you think is dictatorship is not dictatorship. The dictatorship is an eminence of the collective will. It's not really a personalized ruler. It's only personalized in the sense that Hobbes is kind of forced to do this in his historic setting. And therefore, there is kind of, in sense, this is where um, Schmitt doesn't pay attention to the rhetoric of Hobbes. Hobbes' situation is dealing with a real king. In other words, a king, and that if he argues systemic theory, it's going to not be accepted. Okay, so therefore there is an argument. This is what Strauss would say to Schmitt: "Is hey Schmitt, you're not paying attention. That for Hobbes, these two things are united. That yes, authority, but what makes authority? It's the collective. It is this thing that you point to there earlier. This idea that the consent." The people connected to consent. This is what determines legitimacy. It is not the king who creates sovereign legitimacy in that sense. The sovereignty, the authority comes from this consent. Okay? So the power that is collected there, right? That is true. That power, that it's not through truth. It is through the authority of the people who do this, right? So now let's continue this last paragraph, he says. Hence, a detailed presentation of this kind of decisionism and a thorough appreciation of Don Carlos are not yet available. Here, it can be only pointed out that the theological mode of thought of the Spaniard was in complete accord with the thought of the Middle Ages, whose construction was juristic. In other words, the idea that the Middle Ages is a thought of juristic thinking, right? All his perceptions, all his arguments, down to the last atom, were juristic. His lack of understanding of mathematical natural scientific thinking of the 19th century mirrored the outlook of the natural scientific thinking toward decisionism and the specific logic of the juristic thinking that culminates in a personal decision. In other words, his argument is that juristic decision always culminates in a personal decision. Yeah, in a sense, yeah, even the juror has to make a decision, right? But the difference, and I think that's what is this idea: the juristic decision always results in a decision, and this is why he didn't understand the scientific mode, this aggregated model that it's not the individual decision is not important, but rather it's just the overall systemic structure, right? That's the two different ideas here. This is the scientific. The scientific involves the structure. The juristic, the theological and juristic involves as a decision. And this is how he ends the political theology chapter. So, okay, we're going to stop here. It's been a long thing. We've been interrupted many times. If you have any comments or questions, please put it below. Again, remember, this is my kind of break before I do Montesquieu, right? We do Montesquieu. I'd like to, if you have any comments, if you like it, please mention it to other people. If you don't haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. If you know others who want to, please mention others to do this. Now, if you didn't like it, you did thought there was something wrong with it, like this, please put your thumbs down, but then say why in the comments. Give me some criticisms. I admit that although I'm kind of a little bit of a scholar who done some things. I haven't wrote much on Schmitt, but I've I've studied Schmitt and I've reviewed Schmitt. I have lots of reviews published reviews about the works of Schmitt, and I have an understanding of Schmitt that kind of differs from both more of the political theological. Was more directed. So therefore, studying the political theology was interesting for me. Um, uh, uh, um, and and therefore ends it. So therefore, that's it. If you want to follow me more on social media, links are below. If you want, you can always, you want to buy yourself a copy. You can get the Universal Chicago edition of this available online at Amazon. It's available. You can buy used copies. It was addition. I grew up on my first this was the MIT edition, which has been taken over by Chicago. If you can read German, Schmitt is available in German, so please go look at it. It's also available in Spanish and French, so please look at it. If you want to help, in other words, if you want to help me continue doing these kind of videos and these projects, you can do so by subscribing to our Patreon. I understand people like that, or I know, I say, but you don't do things on Patreon, so why should we help you? Again, it would be nice that if you want to help, you can do so. And you can also do so. I have a book at Lulu on Aristotle's, my book on Aristotle's, a notebook on Aristotle, which is not it's a kind of a textbook. It's not really a textbook. It's a kind of study guide. It's a student book, how to basically deal with. It's a chapter by chapter review of the politics. If you buy it by Lulu directly, it's available on Amazon and other places. You can buy buy that book, buy the notebook on Aristotle's politics, notebook for Aristotle's politics, published by Lulu. If you buy it by Lulu, I make that. But again, this is not about that. So if you want to help me, you can buy the book. You can buy my other books. Please buy my other books. But the Lulu book will get me the notebook on Aristotle. I will get the money directly more quickly. Other ways you can help as well. You can have, like I said, Patreon's below. On that, I'm going to stop. Have a good day. Take care, and I hope to finish the next ones. Finish up the political theology in the last chapter. I might skip it though because it's kind of more Spanish, and who knows. Take care. Bye.